Hi, everyone. Welcome to the May 19th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragon, and I'll be joined very shortly by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to recap last weekend's stakes racing from around the country, and we actually do have multiple venues to recap this week, which I know we're both happy about. There were some major races taking place at Churchill Downs. Santa Anita started racing out west as well, and Gulfstream Park, which has been in action. They ran a couple stakes races this weekend, so we'll talk about all of that. We'll mention some impressive maiden and allowance races, the return of some nice horses, particularly Monomoy Girl at Churchill Downs. So we'll talk about all of that. But right off the bat, Craig, let's talk about some of the news that took place in racing this past week. I'm really happy to hear that racing is going to resume in New York very soon. And I just saw Dave Gretting tweeted right before we came on air that the Belmont Stakes date was announced today. It's going to be June 20th, a mile and an eighth. I'm just happy that we have all this to look forward to in the near future.
Yeah, I'm happy we have racing back, especially in New York. It's my favorite circuit. I know you must be happy that it's back as a morning line maker there. Personally, I'm a little disappointed in the distance of the Belmont Stakes, but these kind of things are to be expected. It's not really going to be a Triple Crown this year. As we know it, who knows what will happen if the same horse wins, but I guess we just got to take it day by day and see what happens. I'm sure the Belmont's going to be a great race. It should get a good, strong field, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously it's a different Triple Crown this year than any other year, and we can assess after it all is said and done what it means and how the series might change in the future. I guess there'll be a big push to just make it go back to the way it was in prior years, 3 races in 5 weeks. We'll see how it works this year. I'm not going to make any proclamations about how I think it's going to turn out beforehand because there's still so much uncertainty out there. The one positive is I think it's going to be fun to discuss and sort out all these races. It sounds like there are going to be a lot of big races for 3-year-olds this year, even aside from the Triple Crown races, with these races being spread over 4.5, 5 months. So I just think it's going to be fun to sort it all out once it happens.
Yeah, no problem with that. Like you said, normally after the Triple Crown season, things kind of slow down with the 3-year-olds, and we kind of wait till we have big races like the Haskell and the Travers, of course, and even the Pennsylvania Derby. But it's going to be more prolonged, more big races this year, and really 3-year-olds haven't been trying older horses till very late in the season anyway. So I guess that's one positive we can take from it.
Yeah, and just not to spend too much time on this, but I know that everyone's focused on the Kentucky Derby, and they have been primarily because that was the first race date that was announced, and we've had that on the calendar for a while now. But a September Kentucky Derby, it just doesn't serve quite the same purpose that a May Kentucky Derby would, in the sense that you haven't seen the horses face each other yet, and they're all coming together so early in the 3-year-old seasons. Running it at the end of the year, we're probably going to see these horses run against each other a few times before then, and it's just a different kind of schedule this year. So we'll see what it all means. I'm just happy to have some big races on the calendar. Let's move into the recap portion of this podcast, and we'll start at Churchill Downs, where they will be running the Kentucky Derby in a few months. And we'll begin with that returnee that I mentioned at the top of the show, Monomoy Girl. It wasn't a stakes race. It was just an allowance race on Saturday, but it was good to see her back. She was obviously one of the best horses that we saw on the racetrack in 2018. She was the champion 3-year-old filly that year, winner of the Breeders' Cup Distaff. Hadn't seen her in 18 months, and she got back to the winner's circle. Not the fastest race in the world, but I guess she did what she had to do.
Yeah, I'm not going to put a lot of stock in the figure for this race. She ran a 106. It wasn't the strongest field coming in. It wasn't a race I had any interest in betting in. I know we didn't discuss it on the forecast just for that reason, most likely. But I liked what I saw. I didn't expect her to come back running with 120 TimeformUS speed figure off. I guess it was over a year and a half layoff, but it looked good, and I'll be interested to see where she goes from here. I guess it depends who she shows up against next time as to how you want to treat her as a bettor. But as a fan of the sport, you can never have enough good horses. She's a big name, and I was glad to see her back.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth noting that she had to compete over a sloppy racetrack, which I forget, I didn't look up her PPs. I think she had handled a wet track before, but she definitely handled it on this occasion. There was just not much behind her, and she got a pretty good trip, all things considered. I thought her action coming home the last eighth of a mile, maybe she was just getting tired, but she looked a little bit choppy to me, just not really striding out the way that I had seen from her when she was racing in 2018. But maybe that's just some rust that she had to shake off first time off the layoff. I don't know how much stock to put in that. We'll see where she shows up next time. If she's facing some of the top fillies and mares that are out there in her next race, maybe she's one you want to take a shot against because she is going to have to run a whole lot faster. And there are some good fillies out there right now. I think this is a strong older filly and mare division with performances from Midnight Bisou and CC and Ollie's Candy that we've seen already this year, as well as some others that I'm sure I'm forgetting right now. So it's a strong group of older fillies and mares, and she's going to have to see where she fits among them.
Yeah, this definitely isn't a race where I'd look at the 106 and judging by the way she finished, say, oh, yeah, she definitely could have ran faster, because visually it didn't look like that. And she's obviously going to have to get back into better form and take a step forward. It's certainly possible. I did look it up while you were talking. This was her first try on a wet track, so perhaps that could be an excuse as well.
Another race at Churchill that took place on Saturday, also an allowance race for the fillies, but these 3-year-olds was a 7-furlong race later in the day, and 4 graces for Ian Wilkes got the job done here. She's a horse that we had discussed going all the way back to her debut at Gulfstream Park when she won, I believe, also going 7 furlongs. Pretty impressively that day, and she was a big disappointment second time out going a mile at Gulfstream, but she certainly got back on track here, and I think that second out performance was the real fluke because her first and third starts have really been top-notch.
Yeah, I remember we discussed her because Ian Wilkes, I'm sorry, is a guy who doesn't really do very well first time out. It's not a goal of his, so it was a bit surprising when this horse actually won like she did. And then, as you said, it was pretty disappointing race. She was tracking a fast pace, but it wasn't enough of an excuse to completely write off how she performed. But boy, did she put that in the rearview mirror, because she jumped up to a 111 TimeformUS speed figure, and she had run a 104 in her debut with that brief blip last time in the middle. So a 111 is a really solid figure. I don't want to say that this is a horse who wants a sprint and say that that's the reason she ran bad last time because of the extra distance. And I would imagine they're going to want to try her going longer again pretty soon off this performance.
Yeah, she's a half-sister to McCracken, who could certainly get at least a mile. So we'll see if that's ultimately going to be okay for her, more distance. But I agree with you. I think a mile will be fine. I don't think the distance was the excuse too back. Sometimes horses that run a big race first time out, they just take a step backward second time out, especially for barns that aren't really known for having them cranked up to win their debuts. She might have just done it on sheer talent. It wasn't quite ready for that step up second time out. But I liked the race that she ran at Churchill on Saturday. I thought she was pretty game to run down Miss T2, who was loose on the lead most of the way, looked like a winner coming to the top of the stretch. They both ran well and earned respectable 111 TimeformUS speed figures. I think the one other performance you want to highlight coming out of this race was that of the third place finisher, Aurelia Garland. I've got to be honest, I don't really know what was going on in the early stages. They show the head-on of the start, not the pan shot, so it's hard to really see if she broke that slowly. It seemed like Jose Ortiz just wasn't all that aggressive on her, and she was out the back door early, counter traffic at the top of the stretch. There's an argument that she could have won this race with a clean trip, but she was never going to win with the trip that she got.
No, it was an interesting one. It almost looked like that was the plan, and maybe because she was in a new barn this time, they decided that's how they wanted to run her. But I was impressed with her race. She was the only other one I wanted to mention here outside the top two. And, it's going to be interesting to see where she shows up and if maybe she shows a little more speed next time, because I thought she ran an impressive race. I'm with you, a better trip, and she certainly would have been a lot closer than where she finished.
Moving on to Sunday at Churchill Downs and sticking with the allowance races for the 3-year-olds. This one on the turf going a sprint distance, the feature this day. And the big returnee in this race was last year's Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint winner, 4-wheel drive. He didn't get out of the gate from the rail for Wesley Ward, and his race was really over at that point because he had never shown that he could come from off the pace before. And it was actually the horse that finished second in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf Sprint to him, Chimney Rock, who got the job done here. Good ride from Jose Ortiz, sensing the slow pace and putting this horse up in a tactical position early, and I think it made the difference for him.
Yeah, it did. As you say, the race was pretty much over at the start for four-wheel drive. I'm going to put a line through that one. I'm not going to write him off just yet, but Chimney Rock was good. I think we found out he is a sprinter. He had tried going long last time in that big purse race at Sam Houston, pressed a fast pace and just had nothing left for the finish. But in the turn back to a sprint, he was able to turn the tables on four-wheel drive. It was a good, solid ride, and he dug in. Jack and Noah also, I thought, ran really well, set a strong pace. He was on a clear lead. I say strong in that it wasn't slow. It was moderate maybe, but when challenged, he really dug in. So that's something we hadn't seen from Jack and Noah before. And I thought both the top two ran well. It was a pretty big gap back to third. So outside the excuse of four-wheel drive, I didn't see a whole lot else in here that interested me.
Yeah, I was going to say I thought Jack and Noah got a pretty fortunate trip here because he's obviously a horse that does his best running when he can get out on a clear lead. And while there was some other speed in this race outside of him and four-wheel drive, it was really cheaper speed. And once four-wheel drive didn't break, Jack and Noah just really had all the best of it on the front end in a race where some other horses were compromised by their trip. So I thought he was game to battle back in the late stages, as you said, but I thought his trip was arguably the best of all the horses in here. There's not really a whole lot to highlight outside of the top two. I thought the fourth place finisher, Race Driver, was maybe a little bit unlucky because if you watch his trip down the backstretch, he got shuffled back a few times, had to go extremely wide off the far turn, but his stretch run was a mild one to get up for fourth. So I think the jury's still out on how good he is.
Yeah, as for four-wheel drive, I do want to note it. It's always worth noting the post positions in these sprint races. And for him, he was a horse who had been pretty fortunate to draw outside or near the outside in all his starts. So he was able to sit just off the lead a couple times, get a good trip in the clear. But when you draw inside like this and you haven't shown that ability to handle traffic and you don't break well, the race is pretty much over.
No, I agree with that. The rail is a good place to be when you want to get the shortest trip around the racetrack, but not when you break slowly because that typically causes a lot of problems, especially if you're on a speed horse. One more race to talk about from Churchill this week, also an allowance race on that Sunday card, and that was one that took place right before actually this race, the Chimney Rock one, going on the dirt, 7 furlongs, and Art Collector, making his first start for the Thomas Drury barn, got the job done here over the heavy favorite Toledo. Toledo was a horse that they just keep betting strongly. Hasn't really taken that big step forward that we were hoping to see from him early in the year. He's just been a bit of a disappointment for Chad Brown. Not so for Art Collector, though. This is a horse who showed some promise for Joe Sharp last year and arguably returning better than ever off the trainer switch.
Yeah, this was a good effort. He had one big last time with a 108 speed figure, and he duplicated that here. He did get a good pace to close into. Our early fractions, a quarter and half mile, are coded in red in TimeformUS. These horses, to be graded stakes horses, they're going to have to take a step forward. A 108 in the middle of May isn't really up there with what we've seen from the top horses who were into the low 120s by now. I guess it was okay to see Wrecking Crew at least show some semblance of form after a couple really poor efforts. So he ran okay. But as you said, this group isn't a top 3-year-old or even the grade 3 type just yet. But I did like what I saw visually from Art Collector.
Yeah, and I've got to say, Thomas Drury is a trainer that I'm not that familiar with, focusing mostly on the New York circuit. But I was looking up his stats in Formulator, and he is one of the few major trainers out there that actually has a positive ROI for all of his starters over 5 years. That's quite an accomplishment for a trainer. You rarely see that. I can only think of a few off the top of my head that are able to achieve that. So he's obviously a guy that does a good job, and he was able to improve this horse a little bit off the training of Joe Sharp. I think the big question for Art Collector moving forward is he a confirmed sprinter or is he one that can stretch out in distance in the future? I know they tried it once on the turf and it didn't quite work out, but he's got a pedigree that says going longer might actually be best for him. So I think it remains to be seen what he's ultimately going to be best at.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. He has that kind of running style that you never really know how it's going to stretch out, but he's overcame a slow pace last time and a fast pace this time. So it shows me he's a little bit on the versatile side and maybe some extra distances within his grasp.
Let's move on to Santa Anita, where they ran some stakes races this weekend. And I think the best horse that we saw run over the weekend at Santa Anita was on Sunday when Bellafina took down the Desert Stormer Stakes. I know some people had some concerns that maybe Bellafina wasn't going to be the same horse after that disappointing effort at Oaklawn last time, but we talked about her trip that day quite a bit when we recapped it on the Pacecast. She was a horse that, again, broke from the rail going 6 furlongs and was just in trouble throughout that race. And I think we both thought it was one that you should draw a line through. And I think we got back to the good Bellafina in this race.
Yeah, we did. She ran fine this day. This is a race, I'll be honest, I'm not one to bet chalk, but I almost pulled the trigger at 4-5. I thought that she was that much of a cinch. I didn't do it eventually. I just watched the race, but she ran fine. Now, I'll be the first to admit she got a great, just a perfect trip sitting in behind 2 dueling leaders, all in the clear, was able to tip out and go around them. But that's part of how she runs. She has that tactical speed. She's able to establish that good early position without having to be up front. And I thought it was a good race. She's going to get about a 120 TimeformUS speed figure, I would guess. I don't have the official in from my assistant yet, but all in all, a good effort. And I expect her to be back in graded stakes company probably next time out.
Yeah, I also admit that I was a little surprised that she was as high as 4-5 because I just didn't see the competition for her in this race. I mean, they bet Mother down to 2-1. And I mean, unless you thought that Bellafina's last race was a true indication of where she was at the moment, I mean, she had proven to be superior to Mother in the past. So I was a little surprised they were that close in price. I think the only other thing to really mention out of this race is the fact that we actually saw a disqualification of a horse that fouled another one at the start. That's something that you rarely see in racing these days, but I think it was hard for the stewards not to do that in this situation because it was just so blatantly obvious that Mother would have beaten Fighting Mad, who was third, if not for that problem at the beginning of the race.
I'll be honest, I didn't even realize that occurred. Once the race finished, I turned it off and got on with my day, being run late on Sunday.
Yeah, no, it's something people were obviously upset about that because of that standard that was set by Bayern, which I know still stings a lot of people to this day, even though it happened a number of years ago at this point. But when you beat the horse that you fouled by a nose, it's pretty obvious that that would have made the difference. So I think that's why that occurred there. Another stakes race that took place this past week at Santa Anita was the Echo Eddie. I think there were a couple of California-bred stakes races on the Saturday card for the 3-year-olds, and the one for the 3-year-old Colts and Geldings was actually won by a filly, as a big sweep for Mark Glatt decided to go in this race instead of the Evening Jewel for the fillies and beat the boys here. And I thought it was a pretty game effort from her. She was relentless in the late stages after it looked like the horse that finished second had it wrapped up coming to the 8th pole.
Yeah, I thought this was a good effort. It was interesting. I actually had to go back and try to figure out why she was in the race. I looked through the PPs and thought maybe she had a similar trainer to somebody in the boys version or in the girls version, but that wasn't the case. I found an article by Brad Free of DRF where it just said the trainer thought it was a better spot, had less early speed, and maybe was a little easier spot for her. What's interesting is it turned out it was pretty similar, to be honest. The pace was almost the same, and Big Sweep actually showed a new dimension. She had one close up last time, and this time came from a bit further back. So this is a pretty talented Calbred filly. I'm not sure what the plans are with her. I suspect she is probably going to be best sprinting. She doesn't look like a horse that wants to go much longer to me, but it was just interesting. And mostly I found it a little confusing that this filly won this one, and then a horse that was named something or other Shirley won the boys division, but that one is actually a colt. So, or no, that one is actually a filly, but the whole thing just messed with my head. I'm not sure what was going on there, but solid effort. This one did turn out to be a little faster race. I think the other one got like a 97 or 98 on top. 101 for Big Sweep.
Yeah, I'm sure the trainer had his reasons for choosing this one. And as you said, it was a little surprising that she showed that new dimension here because she had shown so much speed when she won her debut back in March in gate to wire fashion. And this one, she closed down that leader Rookie Mistake, who made that big menacing move off the far turn. I should note, if you watch the replay of this race, take a look at the final 16th of a mile, because Big Sweep actually got hit in the face by Mario Gutierrez's whip on Rookie Mistake. Took a pretty good swipe at her in the late stages, and she kind of turned her head and overcame that to get up by a head. I imagine she would have been placed first regardless, even if she had lost that photo because of that incident in the late stages. But credit to her for showing that grit and determination to get up. And as you said, a good Cal-bred filly, not the best of the 3-year-old fillies out there that we've seen, but for the Cal-breds, it was a solid performance. A faster sprint race speed figure we saw on Friday in a maiden event as Kana, 4-year-old, came back second off the layoff to defeat what seemed to be a pretty promising field of runners, some first-time starters in the mix, some horses with a little bit of experience. But this 4-year-old Kana really took a big step forward here. He came from off the pace in a situation where the pace was actually pretty moderate, going the 5.5 furlong distance, and he was the only horse that made a big run from the back of the pack in here.
Yeah, it was a big effort. He wound up with a 1:15 TimeformUS speed figure. My assistant who does California did flag this one as a little iffy because it was just loaded with lately raced horses. But there were other 5.5 furlong races on the card, 6 furlong races. So he felt pretty confident enough to give it that big number, and it was just a good race. The one thing I'll note, I haven't went back and watched the replays from Friday yet, but we do have it coded as a day in dark blue, which seems to indicate that it was not good to be a speed horse and definitely favored the closers. But I do always recommend people go back, read through the charts, and watch replays if you have the chance to see if you agree with that. And if so, this horse certainly took advantage of that coming from well back in the field.
Yeah, it was one of those days where I wasn't really sure what I thought of the racetrack. There was another 5.5 furlong dirt race early on the card that was just dominated by long shots. So I wonder if that maybe had something to do with the situation, because I know we weigh sometimes the more heavily races that are upsets, and there were some shorter priced horses. I think Galilean went down to defeat as one of the shorter prices in there, and you would have expected that allowance race to get a faster speed figure than this maiden race later on the card. But as I said, that race was dominated by long shots, horses that didn't really look up to that level. And this maiden race, I think the speed figure totally checks out, because Lane Way, who finished third in here, is kind of an amazing horse that he's finished third in all 4 of his career starts. He's actually run speed figures that will be good enough to win a lot of maiden races, but he's had the misfortune of running into horses like Charlatan and Shoot or Shoot, just some really tough maiden races, and he ran into another one here with Kana. But I think he's a good barometer and says this speed figure checks out.
Yeah, not to mention he also is facing Nadal, so pretty strong lineup of horses who have beaten him in maiden races, and he actually got another big figure in here. It was a 112, I believe, so he probably has a title right now of one of the best maidens in America.
A result that I figure surprised both of us a little bit on Saturday was this allowance race, the 4th on the card at Santa Anita, as Axeman was able to resurrect his best form. I know that both of us thought that those good days were behind him, but Axeman came back with one of his better efforts. It's hard to predict when you're going to see it out of him because he's gotten so inconsistent lately, but he got a perfect trip in this race, sitting right off Law Abiding Citizen, who himself really had no excuse. Axeman just wore him down in the late stages.
Yeah, the pace was just average. Law-abiding Citizen basically ran an even race all the way through, started at 121, finished up with a final time figure of 118, and just got worn down by Axeman. He is quite the perplexing horse. You never know which one you're going to get for him, but he's a fun horse I like to see run, so I hope Bob Baffert can keep him together and keep him healthy and get him back in the entry box pretty soon. That would certainly be a good sign. Both of the top 2 ran 119 TimeformUS speed figures, and the third place finisher Multiplier turned him back out of that 1.25 mile Santa Anita handicap, was only good enough for a 116. But I think this race was just too short for him, and maybe he'll do better going long. But as we said, that was a pretty weak version of the Santa Anita handicap, and unfortunately we were able to bet against Multiplier but not come up with the winner.
It's interesting to watch how some of these horses change over time. And Axeman, I think he's a 5-year-old now, so he's getting up there in years. When he burst on the scene as a 3-year-old, he was just this one-dimensional speedball who they couldn't control early in these sprint races. He would just run off. He was part of that extremely fast pace meltdown in the San Vicente a couple years ago. But as he's gotten older, we've seen that he's had trouble keeping up in some of these sprint races. So maybe the mile is just the right distance for him because it allowed him to get into that good stalking trip out in the clear without any kickback. And I think that's probably the kind of trip that he really wants to get. So maybe as he's gotten older, he's just not quite as quick as he once was, but he can still get this 1 mile distance. Final race we're going to talk about from Santa Anita is an allowance race that took place on Sunday. This is another one that featured some interesting returnees, some horses with prior stakes form, though a few of them didn't show up, so it became maybe a slightly easier race, but it was good to see the 3-year-old Collusion Illusion come back to get the job done here. He was the winner of the Best Pal last year. We didn't see him after he disappointed badly in that American Pharaoh, but turning practice sprint distances seemed like it was the right move for him.
Yeah, I thought this was a good effort. I got a 113 TimeformUS speed figure, which considering it's against, if he was an older horse, we probably wouldn't even mention the race. But since it's he's just a 3-year-old, first start since September, when you said he disappointed that American Pharaoh, I thought it was a pretty solid effort from him and a promising sign that he came back running well. He beat a horse like Tiger Dad. Tiger Dad's no world beater, but he's a solid, consistent older horse and good effort. And I'll be curious to see where this one shows up next. I would think they're going to win Tri-Stakes Company. I do wonder what you think. I guess I could take a hint from your earlier talk that you think this one is more of a sprinter.
Yeah, he just seems like one of these smaller, more compact, athletic kind of runners that probably will excel over sprint distances. And the way he finished off this race, I think that the trip and the distance really suited him. Maybe I'm just being a little hard on this horse because it looked like a stronger race going in with the presence of runners like St. Joe Bay and Rowayton, especially Rowayton, who just didn't run at all in this race. He had shown so much promise as a 3-year-old and just seems like, at least in this first start as a 4-year-old, he really hasn't gone on. And as you said, Tiger Dad, who was second here, he's a decent kind of allowance horse, but he's no great shakes. So Collusion Illusion, if he steps up against Stakes Company next time out, even if it's restricted 3-year-old company, I think he's going to face a slightly tougher test. But this was certainly a good way to start off the campaign. And we should mention on Sunday at Santa Anita, Flavien Prat had a gigantic day. I think he won 6 races on the card. I think he was even shooting for 7 late in the day. So quite a display of riding prowess by him.
Yeah, he is a fabulous rider. I don't think there's much doubt he's the top out in California. I remember commenting on Twitter, even a race he lost, what a great ride he had given a horse in a turf race, getting great position from an outside post and just getting beat late. One quick note on Collusion Illusion. I didn't have the pace figures in the chart at the time, but it is going to be a pretty moderate pace when it comes back. I don't think the fractions will be in blue, but the pace figures are less than the final time. So to win that easily from off the pace as he did is a pretty good sign that maybe he could do better than that 113.
Final venue we'll visit on this show is Gulfstream Park down south, and a couple of stakes races took place there this past weekend, topped by the Musical Romance for the Florida-bred fillies and mares. And I know we were both interested in taking a shot against Ladies Island, that speedster trying to stretch out to 7 furlongs. Turned out on this occasion it was not a problem at all. She went fast every step of the way, but she didn't go quite as fast as she's capable of going. I thought they did a good job of rationing out her speed, and they just couldn't catch her. I mean, she just had an insurmountable advantage coming to the top of the stretch, and Wildcat's Beauty tried to take a shot at her, but she just wasn't good enough.
No, and when we talked about the race, I think Ladies Island was 7-5 on the morning line, and we kind of took it from that perspective. And this is another one where I didn't quite pull the trigger, but at 3-1, I was starting to get itchy waiting for that 7-2 because I would have taken a shot with her. She had the best figures going in. You knew she was going to be on the lead all by herself. It was just a question if she could hang on, and boy, did she hang on. She was able to win fairly easily, and this proved the 7 furlongs wasn't a problem at this point in her career. She got a 116 TimeformUS speed figure, which is right up there with what she normally runs when she runs her big races. And as we said when we talk about her before, any race that she's in is going to be big trouble for other speed horses. And when she gets loose, she's dangerous.
No, I know that we've both taken some shots against the morning lines at Gulfstream recently, but this is one that I didn't have a problem with. Ladies Island, as you said, was just coming in with the fastest races, and she's basically a win machine. I know the 7 furlongs was a question. I think it was just a situation where the public on Wildwood's Beauty just focused so much on one aspect of the race, that being the distance. And obviously, she's a horse that can get the 7 furlongs, but it's not like she had run any faster than Ladies Island recently, so I was a little surprised that she was bet down to even money in this race, and she just wasn't good enough. She's got that great record of hitting the exacta in all of her starts on dirt, and that continued here, but she was decidedly second best. And the other horse in this race that attracted support, Bolera, the 7 furlongs was just a bit too short for her.
Yeah, I was going to say that, mention that same thing. I thought she ran okay, and she just couldn't keep up early. And I look forward to her stretching back out because I do think she's a talented filly.
On Friday at Gulfstream Park, they ran another stakes for the 3-year-old filly. So this one going 2 turns on the dirt, a mile and a 16th. And Tonalist Shape, who didn't get the best of trips when she disappointed in the Gulfstream Park Oaks last time, she took a big step down the class ladder here to face a much weaker group of listed stakes horses. And she got the job done, ran her typical kind of race. I wouldn't say this is the kind of performance that's going to change my opinion about her, but nice to see her get back to the winner's circle.
Yeah, she got a 104 TimeformUS speed figure. She did what she was supposed to in here at 2-5, but personally, I wasn't all that impressed with the race. From a speed figure perspective, I think a horse who's been running like Tonalist Shape, even in an easy win like this, you want to see a bigger figure. She actually regressed off her best races, and I'm just not sure what to make of her. I kind of jumped on her bandwagon for one race. She disappointed, and I think I'm back off because I haven't been very impressed, even with the victory here.
Yeah, we're on pretty much the same page. You know that I've never been the biggest fan of this horse either. And she just wasn't facing that much competition here. The one other horse that took a lot of money in this race, Up in Smoke, just a horse for George Weaver that hadn't really run that fast yet. And it turns out that she can't run much faster than she had in her prior starts because she ran basically the same speed figure and was off the board. So Tonalist Shape did what was expected of her. I think they're going to step her back up in class next time. And it'll be a much tougher task for her because, as we talked about on the show recently, there are some pretty good 3-year-old fillies out there. So any graded stakes race that she tries is probably going to be pretty salty. Let's close out the show with one more race from Gulfstream Park. That was an allowance race on Saturday, the one that we previewed on the TimeformUS Forecast last week. And a good job by you, Craig, sniffing out Casino Graham, the winner of this race for Christophe Clement. He had won his debut at Tampa Bay Downs, but was able to make that step up in class to this tougher allowance field at Gulfstream Park. And I know it wasn't the fastest race in the world, but I thought it was a nice step forward, and he looked pretty good doing it.
Yeah, he did visually look good. When I first was looking at what races we were going to talk about today, I was a little torn between this and the Roar Stakes, which featured Green Light Go coming back, but that one didn't run very well despite having some trouble. This one turned out to be the faster race, so I went with this one. Casino Grant got a 103 for the win. He was able to come from off the pace, as I predicted on the forecast last time, due to that good outside post position. He got the expected good ride from Arad Ortiz. And did what you'd expect. He's obviously going to have to make some big improvements to become a stakes horse, but it was only a second career start. I liked what I saw. He handled the extra distance without a problem, and he was pulling away from the end. So this is a promising horse for Christophe Clement.
Yeah, I agree with that. He got the longer distance here. He's a horse that has a lot more of a sprint pedigree on the dam side, but he definitely has some versatility in his pedigree, so yeah, can get the mile, obviously. The big disappointment in this race was Untitled, who we had talked about how his last race wasn't that impressive. He hadn't beaten that much at a very short price, and I think, as you kind of hinted at on the forecast last week, that was probably a sign of things to come because he took another step down here. He just didn't look to be himself for the entire race.
Yeah, sometimes horses, when you watch and they win easy, you look and you can say, yeah, they could have ran faster, but I just didn't really get that impression with him, and I'm not sure what's going on with him. He's actually raced quite a bit since his debut. Maybe he's tailing off at this point, but he's not the same horse we saw early in the year.
Well, that's all the racing to recap this week. We'll continue with the same schedule moving forward. I think we're going to do another TimeformUS forecast this week. We do have a weekend of racing coming up that I think stretches into Memorial Day. So we'll have to discuss and see when they draw these cards and which races we want to talk about. But I think there are going to be plenty of stakes races for us to choose from coming up. So we'll let you know about all of that before we tape, I assume, on Friday. So we'll let you know of that schedule. But Craig, always good to talk about these races with you. Recall that you can also always listen to these podcasts on drf.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week. I'll be back at you with a TimeformUS forecast episode on Friday.